Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So, without more ado, having used up a few minutes before one, I will now welcome our speaker for today, who, as you know, is Dr. Alasdair Coles. He's come all the way from Edinburgh. He's a senior lecturer in neuroimmunology, and so his interests span actually quite a range of different things. A very interesting lab, I think. He's had a very nice recent paper in New England Journal of Medicine on the treatment of multiple sclerosis. So a lot of his work is clinical neurology and so forth, but also has this side interest, if you like, in addition on brain imaging and on the study of the religious or non-religious brain, if you want to call it that. He's also ordained in the Church of England, and so who better than to talk to us today on neuronal imaging of the religious brain. Thanks very much, Alasdair. Over to you.
So thank you for that welcome, Dennis. I have two apologies to start off with. First to you, really, and to those of you who organise these seminars, because I read the fantastic topics and speakers who come each fortnight, and I cannot come because it exactly coincides with my required continuing medical education at the hospital, so I apologise for my absence. Secondly, I am not a contributor to the field I'm about to discuss, and that's quite important, I think. I'm a commentator, and you will hear why I make that distinction as we go through the talk. So what I would like to address is to what extent imaging of the brain can be of use and help to someone who is interested in understanding the human appreciation of God. This is really asking the question, is there anything that we learn from imaging of the brain that is of interest or even of importance to theologians? And I hope that I will be able to get across some of the very significant constraints around the method of imaging the brain and what we can expect of it in the future and what we cannot. And in passing, to describe how, in my opinion, the data from brain imaging has been misused in the past. So, the first question to ask is, why should we look at the anatomy of the brain pathways involved in religious belief, experience and practice? What is the purpose of doing that? Well, there are some people who are interested in brain anatomy. I'm one of them, so we would say anatomy for anatomy's sake, which is fine, but of course that may not light your boat. I think there is a real interest for clinicians and for pastors dealing with people who have brain injury in trying to understand how brain injury might impact on their religious life. And I would like to talk about that at length, but in another context. The third and possibly most important purpose, and the one I wish to address today, is to what extent understanding the anatomy of the brain when it's doing religious things will inform, will raise questions or answer questions that theologians might want to ask or answer. So for instance, the questions that I'll be addressing today is how the human capacity to experience God may have evolved, and what the understanding of brain anatomy can tell us about that. Secondly, I will be giving you data to suggest a relationship between our capacity to experience God and our capacity to experience other humans. And thirdly, I'll be showing you data on an interesting relationship between statements of belief and statements of disbelief. And I hope that those are interesting theological questions. As this talk goes on, I'll show you to what extent understanding brain anatomy can contribute to understanding these issues. The first point I want to make is this, that imaging the brain can show us either the structure of the brain or function. This is a standard MRI scan of the brain. You could get this done in any hospital in the Western world and many in the developing world, which shows you the fine detailed structure of the brain. I'll comment on that in a second. Most of this talk will be about trying to understand the brain at work whilst it's in the scanner. And already you can see the difference between these two techniques. This has fantastic resolution and this does not. And I will enlarge upon that. But if we just focus on structure for a minute, a very reasonable question to ask might be this. Does the structure of the brain of a religious person, however defined, differ from that of a person who does not have a religion? Is there an extra lobule? Is there an extra capacity? And however humorous that is, let me just show you this bit of data, which isn't to do with religious people, but is to do with London taxi drivers. This is analysing the structure of the brain of London taxi drivers. If you do something rather extraordinary for a long period of time, does it change the structure of the brain, is the question. And the answer is definitely yes. And one part of that evidence, the evidence supporting that, comes from this study where a particular part of the brain has been measured, its volume has been measured, in people who've been driving taxis for 50 through to 400 months after doing their knowledge around London. And you can see that very roughly, the more one drives a taxi around London, the more this part of the brain expands, and this part of the brain is known to be useful in spatial navigation. So we see the brain acting here as a muscle. It hypertrophies in response to use. So a very reasonable question to ask would be, if you have a group of serious prayers who've been praying continuously for X period of months, would you see an extraordinary hypertrophy of part of their brain? Very reasonable question to ask. That has never been addressed. Part of the problem is that to do this sort of imaging, one has to know where to look, because you can't measure the volume of every single structure of the brain. So already we encounter a problem. To do this sort of work, we would need to know where to look, to have a clear prior hypothesis, to study any structural change within the brain of religious people. So that is the end of that line of investigation. I'm now going to spend the rest of the time pursuing functional imaging of the brain, that is, looking at the brain whilst it's at work in the scanner. And I'm going to run through several problems. And this list will reappear several times. The first problem is the legacy we now have of the early experimenters. So this is one of the iconic images from two investigators very prominent in this field, Andrew Neuberg and Eugène de Quilly, who did a SPECT scan, which is a radioactive tracer scan, which works like this. You take a trained Buddhist meditator, whatever that is, and you put him in a room with all the things around him that enable him to meditate, and in his case it was incense, smoke, low light, special music, and he would then meditate, and then at his point of most deep meditation, he pulled a rope. At the other end of the rope was Andrew Neuberg and Eugène de Quilly, who come in and inject a radioactive tracer into his arm. And then he is taken off to the scanner, and then under the scan, the position of the radioisotope is determined within his brain, and this isotope binds to the component of blood. So what we see here is blood flow, and we compare the images prior to meditating with those during meditation. And what you find is that there's reduced blood flow in this part of the brain. So there is a change in the brain associated with meditation. in a move which I'll come on to discuss in detail, they reverse infer the function of this part of the brain and say that this is the parietal lobe, which is responsible for integrating sensory inputs, and so reduced blood flow, they say, suggests a deafferentation, a deliberate cutting off from the outside world, and that, they argue, is a component of meditation. Now, Neuberg and de Quilly, in various articles and more particularly books, go on to use data like this to make an argument that suggests that a unitary being exists. What they say is, logic is something like this. We've scanned the brain of someone meditating or praying, we get something like this, therefore meditation or prayer is a real biological event, therefore God is real. That's the logic. They've done that in popular books. This is a list of Andrew Neuberg's books, in which he says that we have a biological need for God, or a biological representation of God. We are born to believe. God changes your brain. Breakthrough findings from a leading neuroscientist. The problem with most of this literature is that it is not science. And the move that I've just described to you of concluding the existence of God from the image of a brain is not allowable by science. So they're making extraordinary and unscientific claims from scientific data, which means that their fellow colleague scientists disparage their work. They also choose not to engage in the routine matter of scientific publication. So this is Andrew Neuberg's entire list of publications in the peer-reviewed literature on this topic. So he's published more books than original articles. And as a basic scientific point, I think that's a slight concern. It's also a concern when you look at the sort of journals that he publishes in, including this one which he founded. So he's not choosing to engage in the neuroscientific mainstream. So neurotheology has a legacy or an inheritance of being slightly dodgy as far as mainstream neuroscientists are concerned. And that is a very big problem, I think, because it's not encouraging people to step into this arena. So, a second issue is how you can replicate an experience within the scanner that is significantly religious, and how you then might go about isolating the component of the experience that is purely religious in terms of your use of controls. So I'm now going to take you through a study, quite a famous study, from a very respected group of functional images in Oxford, led by Irene Tracy, for whom I have a great deal of respect. And you'll remember this study, I'm sure, when I tell you that the headlines of the newspaper reports describing it suggested that religion reduces pain. So, the design is that you take two groups of people, 12 are Catholics and 12 are atheists, and you give them a religious stimulus, which is a picture of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or a non-religious stimulus, which is rather similar, the Lady of the Ermine. And you then electrocute these people. And you then say...
Mildly shocked.
Thank you. Thank you. And you then say, how intense was this feeling as a psychological readout? How moved were you by it? And you scan the patient, the subject. So I've got a few practical points to make here. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with a scanner, you're lying in a very constricted space with about a ton of metal this far from you, and there is quite a loud noise, this sort of noise. If any of you have had a scan for a lumbar disc prolapse or whatever, you'll be familiar with that. And many people find this claustrophobic. So as an experimenter, you're up against it from the start, because you've got to try and recreate in that environment something akin to a religious experience, or you've got to engage a person's higher order of concentration. And also, for reasons which I'm going to come back to, you have to keep repeating it. So, you get 30 seconds of the mood-inducing picture, you get 12 seconds of mild electrical stimulus, thank you sir, 9 seconds in which to respond on a scale, 9 seconds in which to respond to another scale, 12 seconds of rest, and then you go back. And then you go back. Typically 10 to 20 times. You repeat the sequence. So these are strenuous and difficult experiments to do, both for the investigator and the subject, which is why you have such small numbers. Okay, now here is the psychological data, or the reported data, from the atheists and the Catholics who have seen the Blessed Virgin Mary in black, or the non-religious picture in grey. And if you ask them how painful were these electrical stimuli, the Catholics who have just seen the Blessed Virgin Mary will say it was less painful. So that, I think, is very interesting. If you ask the subjects, how moved were you by this particular experience, the Catholics who've just seen the Blessed Virgin Mary will say they were very moved in a positive way, whereas the other people in this experiment or the other condition leads to no emotional impact. Now we could discuss this at length, but can I just point out that you don't need brain imaging to make this interesting. Okay, so the question is, what extra value does brain imaging give you in this experiment? So here are the images, and in a point which I'm going to come back to, these are not images of the brain. These are statistical maps. The blood flow going around the brain of all of these subjects has been measured and then put into a computer, and a calculation has been performed. And if you can read it, it will tell you what the calculation is. So for figure A, the calculation is the blood flow during pain when people have just seen the Blessed Virgin Mary, that is different from the blood flow during pain when they've seen the Lady of the Ermine amongst Catholics, subtracted from the blood flow of pain when in a religious condition, subtracting the blood flow of pain after just seeing the Lady of the Ermine in the atheists. And then a statistical level of significance is drawn for this calculation, and that part of the statistical map that reaches whatever determined level of significance you've determined is drawn as a heat diagram. And all you get is a black box with a single heat plot. And then to make things easy or to confuse people, you then draw on a standard brain space. So these are not images. This is not one person's brain lighting up. And that is a phrase that should be banned from this literature. You'll see the consequences of this in a second. So what the investigators are trying to do is to control for every possible thing that's going on during the subject's experience and elicit that very pure element that is down to the part of seeing the Blessed Virgin Mary and having no pain, or having reduced pain. That's the purpose of it. And you get these heat maps. And the question now is, so what? How has this illuminated what we already knew? And that is another story which I'm going to come back to. So, it is difficult to replicate a religious experience in a scanner. You have to go to great pains, and it's difficult to isolate the very religious component because, as it was pointed out at the time, this is not an adequate control for the test they're about to perform, because there are several differences between this image and this image to Catholics and atheists. Not only is this a person of significance in the life of a Catholic, but also this is a person who is known in some sense to a Catholic, whereas this is a person who's not known. And all that follows could equally be attributed to familiarity versus non-familiarity. So if I had a picture of Theo Walcott, I would be moved because he's a great player for Arsenal. And he's important to me and for Arsenal. And it is possible that everything that follows is simply about familiarity and attraction. Would you agree?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So, the next study I want to show is a study from Sam Harris on imaging of the brain whilst a subject considers statements which are either definitely true or definitely untrue, or for which they may be uncertain. And what Sam Harris is trying to drive at here is the brain mechanisms that underlie belief that something is true versus, or in addition to, belief that something is untrue. And I think an interesting proposition would be, I would have had the prejudice that these two things are the same. If I say I believe in God, and if I say I don't believe in the devil, that these are equivalent statements of security of position. So that would be the null hypothesis. But also, Harris and colleagues have looked at various different types of proposition, from those which are definitely verifiable, such as these, verifiably true and verifiably untrue, to these propositions here, which are verifiably, which are unverifiable. At the moment, at least. It is not possible for us to agree that a personal God exists or that there is no actual creator God, because we cannot prove it one way or the other. My prejudice would be that the brain would handle this sort of proposition very differently from this sort of proposition. So subjects are put in a scanner, they have multiple questions asked, and then you derive your statistical maps, and here is the map of that component of blood flow in the brain that is increased during statements of belief subtracted from the blood flow in the brain of subjects who are making a proposition that they do not believe something to be true. So under my prejudice, under my null hypothesis, you would see no difference. But in fact, you see a difference. Consistently, the left frontal or frontomedial lobe is more active when saying that you believe something to be true. Now that, I think, is interesting. That already raises a question that I would ask theologians or psychologists: what is the difference between saying something is true and saying something that's untrue that would require the brain to handle them differently? But here's a further point. If you just look at mathematical propositions which are verifiable, you get the same area active, exactly the same as with ethical or indeed religious propositions which are unverifiable. So, at the level of brain mapping, it seems that we handle verifiable and unverifiable propositions in exactly the same way. And that, I think, is also interesting. It would lead me to ask theologians and psychologists, well, are people with fundamentalist religious beliefs as secure in their belief about the fact that they should die for rapture as they are that 2 + 2 = 4, that in their brain there is no difference? For instance, one could have a discussion along those lines. Another point, though, of course, is that you and I know in our hearts that these are different sort of things, and yet these brain maps are not picking them up. So who has the ultimate authority? Another point made in this article is that if you do the opposite of what I've just described and search for the area of the brain that seems to be specifically attributable to saying something is untrue, you get another part lighting up, in particular the insula. And now Sam Harris does the trick of reverse inference, which is a technical term for I've seen this before. I've seen this map before, and it occurs in the condition where people are disgusted by tasting something bitter. A primitive reflex that has obvious survival advantage. He says, I've seen these pictures before. They are associated with people feeling joy and happiness. Therefore, and this is the final sentence of this paper, truth may be beauty, beauty truth, and false propositions may actually disgust us. Which is a fantastic poetic ending to a paper, and it leads on to all sorts of propositions and hypotheses. But there are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, Sam Harris sets out in a paper published the following year to try and distinguish brain mechanisms involved in religious and non-religious belief. And there's a whole stack of data here which I'm not going to go into, but there's also this statement. In this study, reducing the statistical threshold in our present study did nominate the insula, the area I've just described, as a region of interest for disbelief in both groups and on both categories of stimuli. However, these areas of signal did not survive our cluster thresholding. So Sam Harris's attempt to replicate his own data has failed. And this brings us back to the dependence of brain imaging on statistics. So to get a similar picture, he had to reduce the level of statistical significance that he accepted as positive, and he had to ignore a technique called cluster thresholding, which is part of the routine analysis of these images. So the same investigator pursuing the same line of thought, using the same methodology, doesn't get the same answer unless he alters the statistics. So I think that should leave us with a sense of the complexity and the lack of security in these sophisticated sort of studies. I'm not picking this out as a bad example, and I think these are very good studies, by the way, and I'm not trying to be overtly critical. I'm just trying to inject a sense of the difficulties involved in this work. But I want to make a point about this reverse inference. I've seen this before. The logic goes like this. I, Sam Harris, in this present study, have found, during people saying that they do not believe something to be true, that the insula is active. In other studies, not done by me, by other people, when other subjects are feeling disgust, the insula is also active. Therefore, the activity of the insula in the present study demonstrates that our people in this study are also feeling disgusted. That is the logic of reverse inference, and that is absolutely routine to the interpreting of functional imaging studies. And I put it to you that that is not scientific. A scientific experiment would be to line up people saying they don't believe something to be true and then getting them to drink rancid milk and studying their brain images. That would truly test the proposition that's been made. And this has very real problems, not only in this sphere but in all functional imaging. And increasingly now the subject is not getting away with this sort of logic.
The experimenter, not the subject.
I meant the topic, sorry.
Yes.
I meant the topic of functional imaging is not getting away with reverse inference to the extent that it used to. Thank you for correcting. I want to mention another study which I think is profoundly helpful as we think about the brain and religion, which again is technically done to a very sophisticated and high quality level, in which 26 subjects were studied with a range of different religious practice, belief and experience. And the first move that these investigators made is to non-prejudicially analyse the experience and practice of these subjects' religious life and derive from that non-prejudicial analysis a way of describing each subject's position in 3 dimensions. Dimension 1 is to what extent they feel that God is involved in their life, either very close or indifferent or not at all. Dimension 2 being whether they feel God is angry with them, or God loves them, or God has no interest in them. Dimension 3 where they derive their religious knowledge, either doctrine, pastors, preaching, or through experience. And the proposition that this group has is that you can pretty much plot these 26 subjects in a 3-dimensional space in their position on these 3 dimensions, on these particular dimensions. And they then image the brains as these subjects answer questions, which places them on these scales, and they ask, when a subject is describing how closely they feel God is involved in their life, which parts of the brain are active. And this crosses the whole domain, from God being very close to them, caring about them, to God not existing or being indifferent. In dimension 2, the parts of the brain that are active when subjects report that God feels anger towards them or love towards them. And then finally dimension 3, where they derive their religious knowledge from. The heart of the question here is whether or not our brains, through evolution, have specifically acquired a module for dealing with religious knowledge. So the contradistinction is language. So you will know that part of being human is to have language, and that is not found in animals in any ordinary way. And that our brains reflect this. So we have in our brains structures that just not are present in animals, or are present in the most rudimentary way. So you can look at the brain of a human and say they have a component structurally there that is not found in animals, and it is attributable to the special module of language that is not found in animals. And the question would then arise, is there a special religious module that is only found structurally in the brain of humans and is not found in the brains of animals, from which we might conclude that religious life is a special, unique component of what it is to be human. And so these pictures were taken of humans going through the range of the religious life, and the question the investigators now say is, well, is this a unique set of pathways, or have we seen this before? And what they say is that we have seen this before. This is the mundane set of pathways that people have when doing experiments of theory of mind. That is to say, if you put subjects in a scanner and ask them to imagine what other people think of them, other people. Not what God thinks of them, but just other people. And similarly, you get exactly these brain pathways active, the investigators say, when you ask individuals in a scanner to imagine what other people think of them emotionally, whether people like them or hate them. And so the proposition, or the speculation of the investigators, is that there is no special module within the brain devoted exclusively to the religious life, as there is in language. Instead, through evolution, the brain has harnessed mechanisms and pathways that are already there for humans to understand the emotions and feelings of other humans about them. First order theory of mind. Now what's interesting about this, if you accept that as true, is this will now raise a big issue for theologians, because these sort of tasks and these sort of brain pathways are active in higher mammals. Higher mammals have the ability to do theory of mind, and they do so with the same sort of mechanisms. So you would this now raises the question, to what extent can higher mammals have an appreciation of God if this is what we're using to appreciate God? Now, I don't have any answer to that, but I hope you see how this study usefully raises these issues in a way which, if a particular God module had been identified, we could have put to rest. Now, that is the kind of end, in my opinion, of the useful functional imaging literature around the religious life. I want to just make a few concluding remarks about what might else be out there. And this is a study which isn't technically done particularly well, I don't think, but raises an interesting new line of attack, which is also brain imaging now with PET, positron electron tomography, in which you essentially take a chemical, an identifiable chemical tracer, put it into the brains of people undergoing various experiences, and ask how well that chemical binds to this or that part of the brain. And the chemical system that's being studied here is serotonin. And this is very interesting, of course, because serotonin is part of the neurotransmitter responsible for mood. A low level is associated with depression, and most conventional antidepressant drugs elevate the level of this drug in the brain. So you can see that knowing quite what this system involvement in spiritual experience is quite relevant to a lot of people. And the sort of data that comes out of this, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but just by way of illustration, is you point your scanner at various different parts of the brain, and you measure, along here, how well your chemical tracer binds to that part of the brain. So this person has got a lot of binding at 5-HT in his raphe. This person has very little. And you then make a correlation with something about these people. This is about their everyday experience of self-transcendence, the ability to, as it were, leave this earthly prison and communicate with another world. This is a score about these people's ability to accept a spiritual life and accept a benign God, for instance. These are things that don't have to happen in the scanner. This is the type of people, as they live their day-to-day lives, how do they score on these things? And you can see that an attempt has been made to correlate the binding of a particular chemical in a particular part of the brain with their day-to-day personality type or religious experience type. And you may or may not be persuaded by the level of correlation in these areas. I think here, that is bordering on imaginative, but that looks pretty tight to me, and no doubt there are ways that we can interrogate these data statistically. But I bring this here to illustrate the sort of ways that brain imaging can help outside of localizing structural anatomical pathways. I want to make just 2 points about the sociology of brain imaging in this sphere. The first is that almost any publication that deals with functional imaging of people having religious experience gets wide media exposure. So this study, in which 15 Carmelite nuns were shoved into an MRI scanner and told to pray, was the #1 hit on the BBC Science website for that year. And when I asked some journalists why this was, they said it's obvious, because we all conjure up the images of nuns in their wimples being shoved into scanners. And that's such an attractive image. And the other point, of course, is that the end data, those scans which I've shown you with nice heat spots on them, are intuitively understandable. in a way that producing the whole genome screen of a complex disease just isn't. So this sort of work gets into the public sphere more rapidly and more comprehensively than many other forms of science. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, but we need to be cautious about that. The second thing, and I'd be interested to get your views on this, is that I think that brain imaging has led to a new form of reductionism. So that we've had various forms of reductionism over the millennia, I suppose. I think a particular one at the moment is the issue that I am not in control of myself. It is my neurons that make me do it. Everything that I am is an expression of my neuronal activity. See the front of the Observer magazine 3 weeks ago. My neurons made me do it. I am nothing but neuronal activity. I don't think at a philosophical level that's any different from saying I'm nothing but the expression of my genes, or I'm nothing but the expression of levers and pulleys in my brain as per Descartes. And of course this raises an issue, and I'm pleased that this has come back, that recently people in sort of discussions like this now saying, well, where does the soul fit in? So this soul word, which has been kind of put to one side by everyone for decades at least, is now back in the frame as a counterpoint to reductionism and dualism. Now, I've been fairly critical of functional imaging, I hope appropriately, but you can come back at me if you feel I haven't. But I want to make a party political broadcast now, briefly, for the other ways of investigating the religious brain. So we've talked about imaging here. These are different parts of the brain to which you can attribute different components of the religious life. We haven't discussed drugs at all, and I think they are quite informative on the neuroanatomy of the religious brain. But another whole area which I personally think is more eloquent and more helpful to understanding the religious brain is seeing the consequences of brain diseases. So, by summary, I think functional imaging does have significant methodological problems, but I believe we can conclude from what I've shown you that the brain is involved in the religious life. And for some people, that is big news. And that, I think, is interesting in itself. It's clear that different parts of the brain subserve different components of the religious life, experience and belief, and you can plot it out in this way. Belief and disbelief are handled differently. And that isn't something I would have imagined. And at the level of resolution of brain scans, at least, there doesn't seem to be a difference in the way the brain handles belief in the verifiable and the unverifiable. And that is fascinating. And there is no special religious module, unlike language, and it seems that evolution has poached networks of social cognition, the everyday skill we have in understanding what other people think of us, to allow us to understand what God thinks and feels about us. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Alasdair. I'm sure that's stimulated plenty of questions, so we have some time now for questions and discussion, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. You pointed out some obvious scientific flaws in some earlier research. I'd like to raise a theological concern as well. There seems to be, in a lot of talk of religious experience and religious life, there seems to be a kind of artificial distinction brought in between the spiritual and the physical. For example, would you consider it a religious experience to have your feet washed, or to have breakfast on the beach, or to give someone a cup of cold water, or to feed someone who was hungry? And I think that the idea that God might have his own spot in our brains, or even his own slot in our lives is at odds with the New Testament, which seems to talk more about God transforming our entire way of thinking and our entire way of living.
So I completely agree with you. And I guess the problem here lies in the lack of dialogue between people doing this science and those who are theologically sensitive and aware. And I think both parties can be criticised.
Thank you. Yep.
Just within
Yes.
all that you've been doing, your contact is quite broad with a whole range of people, isn't it? In medical distress as well, I imagine.
Yeah.
Have you had any sort of cross-referral to religious experience that they've had? Something really desperate, you know, if they're in desperate circumstances and that sort of thing. Have
You mean people who are unwell or suffering in some way, who
Yes.
have an intense experience?
Yes, yeah.
Um,
Well, was that part of your study?
well, I can tell you what I have studied, and I haven't mentioned it here, is people with epilepsy who, as a result of that, have experiences which are due to epilepsy but have a religious content. And the interesting issue arises there as to whether these are authentic or inauthentic expressions of spirituality, whether or not you should or shouldn't take anticonvulsant drugs, for instance. And that is a complex area.
And the second thing, amongst this varied audience of people that may have had a religious experience, and be so interested to come today.
Yes,
Just airing an opinion.
Yes, well, thank you.
Yes. Other questions, please. Yes.
I really apologize, I totally forgot about the reference, but about 10 years ago in a German science magazine I found this article about they built a helmet, and when
Yes.
you put it on, it activates a certain area in the
Yes.
brain, then you have this near-death
Yes.
experiences.
Yes, this is Michael Persinger's helmet, which is a motorcycle helmet with little electrodes on it, which supposedly stimulates the temporal lobe, and as a result you get micro seizures which lead you to have experiences of God, which we were just discussing. And Richard Dawkins tried this motorcycle helmet on and disappointed everyone by not having any experience at all. And there's a lovely panorama program about this which is available on YouTube. I mean, I will quickly say that none of that data is in peer-reviewed scientific literature. None of it. It couldn't stand it.
Yes.
I know it's only a minor detail, but I want to pick you up on that graph you showed of the taxi driver,
Yeah,
the line.
yeah.
In fact, if you were to only take them up to 20 years of experience, the line would have shown a negative correlation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I use that because of its sort of comical value, but I hope it is a solid statement to say that the literature as a whole supports the fact that skilled, frequent use does alter the structure of the brain. So pianists, for instance, will have different motor cortices than those who are not engaged in the fine movement of the fingers. I completely accept your point, but I hope that I haven't misrepresented the literature as a whole.
I mean, is anyone planning on repeating that work? It's so often cited.
Yeah.
And as you rightly pointed out, if you just take a couple of points out, you lose your, your correlation significance. So I do wonder if someone's going to repeat that sometime.
Yeah.
Just to
I'm not aware of it, but I wouldn't necessarily get to hear of it. But the work of Mark Hallett, particularly on pianists, I think is robust. Perhaps I should present that. And then.
Yes, please.
A lot of what is known about the functional structure of the brain is known before sort of imaging as we have nowadays, just by sort of pathology, either by brain injury or stroke.
Yeah.
Language would be a classical example.
Yes.
Similar stage of the frontal
Yes.
cortex as well. But I don't know much about the religious experience. Have there been cases reported or that you've
Yes.
heard of somebody being a believer and then being a non-believer
Yes.
post-stroke or vice versa?
Yes, so I'm so pleased that you asked this question. So the question is that a lot of what we know about the brain, for instance around language, we've not learned from functional imaging, which is relatively new, but we've learned from studying the effects of brain injury, stroke and traumatic injury to the brain. And the question is, what do we know about religion or the religious brain and such? And what I would say is that it was absolutely mainstream in the 19th century, early 20th century to study the effects of brain injury on spirituality. Absolutely routine. So the varieties of religious experience, William James, the first chapter is called The Neurology of Religion, and talks about this. So it was part of neuroscience mainstream. And there's a great deal of literature which I'd love to come and tell you about, and which to repeat myself, I think is actually more rewarding than what I've shown you today.
Please, yes.
What may be a destructive question. Does functional brain imaging tell us anything in the level of detail that would really be required to analyse these complex mental processes?
I mean, I think it would be, the way I would see it at the moment is that functional imaging is a new science. It unfortunately is very media friendly and has got ahead of itself, and many of the propositions that arise from it just are not tenable. But it's now growing up, so it's in its kind of teenage years, so I hope that we will learn something from it. But at the moment, if you said to me that we haven't learned anything useful, I would tend to agree with you. I mean, I've given you the best examples that I know of. And if you're not impressed, then I think I share that with you.
Can I ask a related point? I mean, in the blood flow imaging sort of experiments, I mean, one's looking there at how many neurons, I mean, have to metabolically increase, to give you a signal. I mean, I think we're talking about quite a few, aren't we? So,
Yeah,
so do you want to, these little spots that look so small on screen, how many neurons are we talking about now?
Well, the first thing is that it is an assumption that we're looking at blood flow. So the physics around the bold fMRI image is highly contested. And a couple of years ago in Nature, there was a prominent article saying you're just not measuring the right thing. So already we have a problem, already. But maybe we're not looking at blood flow. But we're talking about many millions of neurons. No one knows exactly how many, Dennis, because it's very difficult to do these experiments. In animals, we're talking about millions upon millions of neurons to get any sign of change in the bulb signal. Scanners are becoming more sensitive, certainly 7 Tesla scanners and higher, which are barely compatible with having a human subject within them, do have much nicer images. So it's possible that technology will help us.
Thank you.
But actually, if I quickly say, I think the technology hasn't been a problem today. I think it's the design of the experiments that's been a problem.
Please here, and then go
So
back.
I wondered about the connections between other physiological symptoms. I mean, the ancient yogins of ancient India, as I understood it, could at will lower their blood pressure, their blood pulses and all the rest of it, and their temperature. So they could, through their physiological practice of sustained meditation, lower blood flows around wherever without affecting the particular neural pathways in the brain, I suppose. And the other question I was thinking about, you talked about muscle memory in pianists. Well, that is a well-known phenomenon, isn't it? And in sportsmen as well. And these things linger. If you're a pianist and you're a sportsman, you have muscle memories when you're not playing the piano or playing tennis or what have you. And I wondered if there were anything to suggest that things affecting the biophysiological system, whether it's the neurology or not, you've done it while someone was thinking about the religious experience, but are there any studies to show that that they are permanent, semi-permanent changes?
So I think in terms of hardcore scientific literature, the answer is no. But I'm very sympathetic to the idea that religious experience involves more than just the brain. And of course, we have ancient religious practices that are designed to induce spiritual experience. I think the whirling dervishes are a really interesting example, who end up in a dehydrated, hypotensive collapse. Why is that helpful? We could ask ourselves. So I agree with you, but I don't think there's any hard data to inform this topic.
Stuart, did you have a comment on that point? No. Okay, so let's go back to that question. Yes, please. Yes.
Just on the third experiment you spoke about how the same patterns appeared when that relationship with God as to relationship to others around us, how they perceive. Is it possible to infer from
if that is true, and we have a little reservation, I would have some reservation about it, the consequence would be is that if you are not capable of theory of mind, if you're not capable of inferring what people think about you, then you might not be capable of appreciating God in the sense that you or I do. And a very good example of this would be a high-level autistic who is simply unable to perform theory of mind tasks. So if this is true, and if it's the only system that we use to appreciate God, then that would mean a high-level autistic could not experience God in the way that you or I do. And that, I think, is useful at a sort of ministerial or clinical level, isn't it? Please, you've put your hand up twice. So
yeah, but the better data for that would be to do the direct observation. So you're replacing what is a correlation with uncertainties by the direct experiment, which is to study autistics and see whether there is an absence of people with reporting religious commitment and experience and so on. And I don't know that that's been done.
Well, so firstly, I completely agree with you, and I hope that was the implication of what I was saying. That in some ways these scanners just get in the way, and you're better off doing the direct comparison. So we have tried to do this. So Simon Baron-Cohen has a group, a larger group on autism. The trouble is, it's very difficult to engage a high-level autistic around these issues and to ask them with language how they appreciate God. It's very difficult. It's beyond my capacity anyway.
I can think of an individual who might be a potential person.
Yeah, well, and studying an individual can often lead us to helpful hypotheses. Yeah.
Okay, well, we do finish sharp at 2 because I know lots of people have to run away for other things. Just before we thank our speaker again, can I also mention we have a very good Faraday paper which happens to be written by the person who was just speaking, Stuart Judge from Oxford, and I think it's called Are We Nothing But Neurons, or something like that, which is a phrase that Alasdair also used. The Faraday papers, I suspect, are on the book table, and if they're not, you can download them for free off our website, and one of those papers is by Stuart Judge. I do recommend that to you if you're interested in religion and the neurosciences. But last but not least, let's thank Alasdair for a really fascinating talk. So thank you very much.